When switching to virtual tours, one of the biggest differences for a guide is the lack of feedback. With your group in front of you, you can pick up on body language and get a sense of the vibe. Through screen, you lose a lot of these cues. And it's even more difficult when you're not able to see or hear your guests, limited to reading their comments in a chat box. This virtual barrier also makes it difficult to interact with them, even if you have the ability to speak and listen to your guests. Language differences become even more pronounced through fuzzy audio. Questions are delayed after you've already moved on to the next topic. But making an engaging and interactive virtual tour is possible, so long as you modify it for the medium. In this article, I'll lay out the challenges in making a virtual tour interactive and some solutions to help engage your guests, even if you're on the other side of a computer screen. So, challenge. You've limited information on your guests. If you're doing a huge live stream, you might have guests joining in and out, sometimes more than you can count. Other times, you only have the information of the person who booked the tour, but have no idea who else might be watching along with them. You're also missing out on the obvious information you could observe in person, such as age, gender, relationships between your guests, what mood they're in, etc. Solution: set aside the first 5 to 10 minutes of your tour to get to know your guests. When in person, the first 15 minutes of your tour are the most important when it comes to collecting information, and virtual tours should be no different. Announce to guests that you want to get to know each other quickly before you start, and keep it simple with 1 or 2 questions. If guests can respond with their answers out loud, you might want to call on each one to take turns. If you have a large group and have them type into the comment section, you could just read out a few. Some questions you might ask. Let us know where you're tuning in from and what made you choose this tour. Or, I'm curious to know where you're watching from and if you're watching with anyone else today. Or, let me know if you've ever been to my city or if you're hoping to visit soon in the future. This information can give you a little bit to play around with during the tour and allows you to adapt slightly depending on things like the location of your guests or whether or not they've been to your city. Afterwards, it's the perfect segue to introducing yourself and kicking off the tour. Another challenge. Virtual travelers tend to be a bit more passive, watching quietly or refraining from asking too many questions. Guides are no stranger to the shy guest. We've all had them. But with virtual tours, it can seem like an entire group of shy guests. Conversely, it might be difficult to have very chatty guests on a tour that's virtual, with time delays, making it logistically tricky to interact in real time. A solution: you can still engage with your guests without them having to interject. For example, whenever possible, relate things back to them so that they feel included. An easy way to do that is by referencing the country or city that they've told you they're watching from. So, for example, this is a great ramen chain. There's actually one in New York City, Maria, so you can get a taste of Tokyo right in your city. Or when your fellow country people joined the war, it made a really big difference to turn things around. You can also use guests as an example by using their name. So let's say Lynn was a local here in Buenos Aires, hanging out with her friends at a park one Saturday. If she were the one in charge of preparing the mate, Lynn would put it together and then drink the first cup. Or you could even make them historical figures. For example, let's say Sanjeev was a young aristocrat here in Paris, right? You just add them in. You can even engage them through easy, low-stake trivia by asking your guests to guess a number or a year before you give the answer. So if you had to guess, do you think the Germans or the Czechs drink more beer per person on average? Challenge. Guests aren't there to tell you what they like. In person, it's very easy to ask guests what they're interested in and get a sense of how to adjust the tour. On a virtual tour, especially when you can't see their faces, it's really hard to gauge what they're enjoying and when they're kind of drifting off. Solution: give guests A or B options whenever you can. One of my favorite virtual tours that I've taken so far was of a famous temple in Taipei, Taiwan, with Tour Me Away. There were tons of gods in this temple, and our guide let us each choose which one we wanted to hear about. Right? So he's like, okay, so there's the god of medicine, the god of voyages, the god of study, and we got to pick which ones. And it made us feel like we had some control over the content, and certainly made us pay more attention when it came time to talk about the God that we chose. If possible, you can even give guests route options. Okay, so we can take the path through the park where you'll see lots of locals hanging out, or we can go around the edge where you'll have a view of the city below. Which one would you prefer? It's important to note, don't give them more than 2 options. That's when choice paralysis really sets in. Make it very, very simple for them to choose. And final challenge, your time is limited. Many virtual tours have a much shorter time limit than in-person tours. And if you're trying to cover a lot of area, it makes it stressful when guests cut in with questions at a time where you really need to keep moving. Solution, have set times for questions and make sure to communicate that to your guests. I recently took a virtual Vietnamese coffee class on virtual trips, and the guy did a great job of designating time for questions. He told us at the very beginning that there would be 2 periods of brewing when we would have to wait for the coffee. And during those times, he would flip the camera around to his face, which was a great additional visual cue, and go through any questions that were put into the chat box. This allows you to better control the flow of your tour, as you'll have built-in space ahead of time for any questions.